Oh yeah, how many people are we expecting?
Yeah, we have, it's a good question. I think we're gonna have a good group and they're all trickling in right now. I would expect maybe around 50, we'll see.
Cool.
All right, well, I'm gonna just get us started here. Welcome everyone, and good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for the second week of Point Blue's Rangeland Fire Ecology and Management Speaker Series. So for those who don't know me, my name's Chelsea Carey. I'm a soil ecologist with Point Blue, and I serve as the research director of our Working Lands group. And I'm helping to organize this series, which we're hosting in collaboration with our partners at Tomcat Ranch. So the goal of the series is meant to cover emerging research and programs on wildfire and prescribed burns that are relevant to the ecology and management of California's rangelands. This series, it's running through March and into April, and we have a really awesome lineup of speakers that we're really fortunate to have join us every Thursday at this time. So you can find the latest information for each speaker and presentation and a link that I'm going to drop in the chat box for those who don't already have it. I think at this point, most people do, but just in case. And I'll be updating it as this series progresses to include links to speaker abstracts and bios. So go ahead and check back there for the latest information throughout. And before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to just take care of some housekeeping items. So each session is scheduled to be an hour long, and I've asked the speakers to allow something like 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. Everybody has been muted upon entry, and so that's so we can ensure the presenter is heard clearly throughout. You can go ahead and use the chat function to share any questions you have throughout the presentation. And if you feel inspired, you can go ahead and add your name and affiliation with your questions, so that will help me know who they're coming from. All questions will be directed directly to me, and at the end, I'll read through what has been shared in the chat box to facilitate Q&A with the speaker. And so we'll get to as many questions as we can in that time. If you, most people probably don't, but if you need help finding the chat box, you can open it up by clicking on the chat bubble icon that's on the control bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll also just want to note that the session is being recorded, and so and unless otherwise requested by any of the speakers, each presentation is going to be made available on our YouTube channel for public viewing. So I think that's it for housekeeping. I'll paste some of this information into the chat box for your reference as well. And if you have any technical questions throughout, you can also send me a message via the chat box and I'll try to help you out. Okay, so now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for today, who we're really lucky to have join us, Dr. Sasha Berleman. So Dr. Burliman is the director of the Fire Forward program at the nonprofit conservation organization Audubon Canyon Ranch. And she serves as the co-chair of the North Bay's Prescribed Burn Association, the Good Fire Alliance. Dr. Burliman received her doctorate in fire ecology from UC Berkeley, and today she's going to talk with us about her work on fire as a tool for ecological stewardship in the Bay Area. So Dr. Burliman, thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad for the opportunity to hear about your work, and please take it away.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'm super excited to be here. Point Blue is amazing, so it's a total honor to present. I like to start with a little introduction of my background because it can kind of sound odd to people that there's a job called the fire ecologist or that you can get a degree in fire science sometimes. Not so much as we move forward into our current situation with fire in California. But I grew up in Southern California in a valley that's just completely surrounded by mountains, as you can see in this pixelated image. And every summer growing up, those mountains would go up in really significant flames. So I never knew what a snow day was, but I did have lots of smoke days growing up. Lots of days where I'd walk out and see white ash on the lawn or catch white ash in my hand as though it was snow. And definitely had like night terrors as a kid about trying to save my family from raging wildfires. So it was a big part of my life growing up, which I think we're seeing more and more might be a true story for a lot of youth growing up now in the North Bay area. But it took me until I got into community college age to finally learn the other side of the fire story in California, which is that people lived for thousands of years and continue to, in some places, really positively with fire. And it was the main tool by which California landscapes were managed and tended for thousands and thousands of years. So in community college, I, as part of an honors program, was told to go become a docent of this nature preserve, which is Santa Rosa Plateau in Southern California, where every piece of this plateau depends on fire to thrive. And it blew my mind that it took until community college age for me to learn for the very first time this very core tenet of ecology in California, that fire is a necessary and incredible resource for managing these landscapes. So I transferred to UC Berkeley, got involved in the Stevens Lab, pursued a graduate degree after that, and was determined that in a world full of lots of challenges that feel unsolvable to, or at least have and did to me, this seemed like one that we should be able to solve. There's really good precedence for us being able to find a way to live in a positive way with fire. And so I've kind of dedicated myself to that question and seeking the answer to that ever since. Nowadays, I'm the director of Fire Forward, which is a program that I created at Audubon Canyon Ranch. And we're striving to change the way we live with fire in the Bay Area and in some cases and ways on the state level as well. So I like to kind of dial back to a little bit of basically fire science first to kind of start us off. And depending on where your windows are, you may need to like move them around to be able to see these slides at any given time. Since I use the full screen format, I'm probably gonna have to change that for Zoom soon. But I really like going to this one paper that was done by the principal investigator at the lab that I did my grad school in, which is prehistoric fire area and emissions from California's forests, woodlands, shrublands, and grasslands. And a really key finding of this paper, if I can change it, there we go, was that approximately 1 million hectares, which is 4.5 million acres essentially, burned every year in California prior to 1800. And that was for a long time, that was basically the same as the total amount of area that burned during an entire decade that was considered extreme fire behavior in the United States, across the entire United States. That statistic is becoming more interesting in some ways because I think just this past summer, California saw 4.5 million acres burned, except not very much of that in intended management fire, but rather in mega fires of catastrophic impact in some cases. So things are changing dramatically and quickly. But as you can see from this map and from this graph, lightning is not a major source of ignition across much of the state. And yet we're a state that is completely fire dependent, and all of our ecosystems have fire regularly, and we have fire scars on our trees and coal or charcoal layers in our lake bed sediments that show us and tell us that fire was burning on really regular intervals across much of the state for thousands of years. And the reason for that is people. So just as the Bay Area is a really, really popular place to be and live nowadays, it has been for millennia. It offers so many beautiful resources, so many different ecosystems in very small distances to travel, great weather year round, like all of the same things that we love about this landscape and the reasons we love this place are part of the same reason why this area attracted many, many diverse peoples for thousands of years. And all of those diverse peoples using fire as a primary tool for managing the land. But of course, colonization, we really didn't know what we were doing. There was a lot of racist undertones and we were really scared of fire. So colonizers started putting out massive propaganda to enforce and encourage fire suppression, starting with death rides of man is reckless or careless, and then going to some really terrible racist propaganda in a different way around trying to protect our timber from essentially like burning, which this is during a time that our timber was a critical resource for being able to protect our ability to perform in war. So we were worried that our timber was under threat due to war, and we're trying to protect it from that. And then, of course, we land on probably the most influential propaganda campaign that has ever existed, Smokey the Bear, known worldwide for his incredible slogan that, second graders can chant to you. So huge propaganda campaign, we need fire suppression. And really what we see when we look, so this team of researchers, really incredible team, spent 5 years trying to show how climate and fire, or that fire regimes or fire eras in California is driven by climate. And I'm gonna give you a caveat to this in a minute, but what they found was that climate was not the main driver of fire behavior in fire history. The main driver of fire eras in California, or chunks of time where fire is burning similar acreages in similar ways, was people. So we have here a graph. The 4 shaded pastel areas are showing the different eras of fire in California. And then we have the triangle line, which is populations of Native American peoples, and the circle line showing populations of European colonizers into this area. So you see pretty quickly there's a very strong correlation with people and what's going on with people and fire eras in California. This isn't to say that climate change isn't happening or climate change isn't impacting fire. It absolutely is. We all know that. And the main ways in which it's doing that is extending fire season to be longer and triggering more dramatic fire weather events. So more dramatic and longer fire seasons. And we very may well start seeing climate driving a new fire era today. But when we look back at history in California, it's really fire eras have been driven by people and the way people are behaving on the landscape. And that brings us to this really awesome understanding of what is good fire in each of these different ecosystems that we have. So we can go back, each ecosystem, and when we use fire science, each ecosystem has its own fire regime, which is the type of fire that is expected to burn through that area, that's natural for that ecosystem, and that fosters good biodiversity and tends that ecosystem for the long haul. There are multiple factors that are involved in fire regimes, but one of them is the fire return interval, or the frequency that fire burns in any given point on the landscape. So these are in years. So you can see here, oak woodlands, the median would be every 2 years, and going as high as 8 to 11 years. 2 years would be like pretty intensively managed oak woodlands. So that'd be ones where they're being stewarded for acorn production or other such uses. One that gets people sometimes is like redwoods. The median is 10, and that's for all redwoods across the state. When we've looked at fire history analyses for the Marin area, redwood stands were burning every 4 years for thousands of years. So really frequent fire in redwoods as well, which may feel like a very different picture if you're imagining what you may have seen in redwoods in the North Bay area over your lifetime, where they've got piles and piles of fuel built up and haven't seen fire in a really long time. And then you may start to paint a picture of what that looked like and how it burns in wildfire versus a redwood stand that's burning every 4 years with very low fire behavior in the understory. So I just like to share this because these are all ecosystems that we're familiar with if we're spending time in the outdoors in this area. And that frequency of fire return is maybe not what you might expect based on life experience. So when we look at other areas where fire has been allowed to burn within its normal fire behavior, and we stop suppressing it, what we've seen, this is a paper that was done, a study that was done in the Illilouette Basin of Yosemite. And what they found when they stopped suppressing fires in that area that were coming from lightning ignition, so not during extreme weather events, we're not talking about power lines going down because of high winds, but these lightning events happening in the Illilouette Basin, these fires started becoming self-limiting. And so each fire burns for a little ways. The conditions don't allow it to burn very, very large. But then as these different fires start burning, they start running into each other's perimeters. And you get this mosaic pattern across the landscape where fires are self-limiting. They can't burn past where the next fire perimeter is. And so there is some context for seeing how this could apply to the Bay Area. It would be in very different conditions, and we could dive into that. But this is something that we've seen work to some extent, even in our severe fire weather here in the Bay Area, where we've done multiple prescribed burns in the last 5 years, that when these extreme wildfires hit those prescribed burns, the area that we're treating with prescribed fire the year before isn't re-burning in wildfire. And instead, there is, of course, ember cast that's getting past these little patchwork burns that we're putting on the landscape. There is no fire within the prescribed burn area. So we are seeing these types of impacts already. And as a result of all of this fire for millennia, we start seeing survival strategies that are specific to these different species that are part of all of these assemblages in California. So we have resistors that have developed really thick insulating bark so that the heat doesn't burn the cambium when it moves through. We have sprouters, so redwoods being one example, and some other chaparral shrub species being other examples, bay laurel being another one, where they've accepted that the main tree may burn in a fire, and so they're ready to send up new sprouts to keep the generation going afterward. And we have cedars like knobcone pine or bishop pine being a couple examples of that, where they need fire in order to open the cones and put viable seed back down on the landscape so that they can grow a new generation. Another one of the cedar category would be all of the wildflowers that are fire dependent in chaparral. So fire poppy being one example, where we have all these wildflower species in chaparral that depend on fire to germinate, and they can stay dormant in the soil for 150 plus years waiting for fire to move through, and then they all pop up at once. Invaders, which doesn't necessarily mean invasive species, but even things like California poppies or lupins can be invasive, not invasive, but invaders in the species survival strategies. They recolonize areas that are burned. And then avoiders, so that can be some types of marsh species or some types of riparian species that are trying to not see fire all that often. So there are many uses for prescribed burning in our ecosystems. And one of the really basic ones that kind of gets people started in prescribed burning can often be weed control. And there are many different weeds that you can use fire for in different ways with different levels of success. So Medusa head has a 1-year seed bank. So it's one that's kind of the poster child for prescribed burning, because you can do one prescribed burn, and if it's timed right and it's large enough to get at the entire patch in that area, you can get pretty much like 99.9% eradication of Medusa head within the burn area. And then we have yellow star thistle, which is a little bit more challenging to get the timing right. Usually that's like a July burn and it may take multiple burns. But another one where if you get that timing right and you do get after it, you can absolutely successfully control yellow star thistle, or at least minimize its populations using prescribed fire. Another one would be goat grass, which is in the middle there. And goat grass is like Medusa head's evil twin. It's got a 2-year seed bank and it invades into riparian areas. And so, or not riparian, into serpentine areas. So it brings a whole new suite of challenges. But if you burn goat grass 2 years in a row, if you can get enough thatch in between those 2 years, you can actually get really successful control of goat grass as well. By using kind of the same methodology as Medusa head, just ×2. You then get into some of the brooms, which it's always a really interesting one there because one wildfire or prescribed fire flushes the entire seed bank of both of the broom species, the Scotch and French broom. So you get this massive pulse of broom germinating all over the place, and it can look like a carpet of seedlings. But what that does is it means that rather than having many years of germinating seedlings, you're going to have one crazy year right after fire moves through that allows you to take that moment to go back in and do a follow-up. And you could pretty much eradicate or get close to eradicating an entire broom population by just doing those 2 years of treatment again, if you've got that follow-up planned. And another one that gets more challenging is harding grass, or really any of the perennial grasses where they do build up. If they build up thatch, you can get fire to move through them, get fire to burn pretty hot, but they're perennial, they're bunch grasses, so they are going to resprout, they're going to come back. And what we've been able to do, we've done some pretty significant restoration of harding grass invaded areas by burning and then following up with just a hand tool and going back out there. And as those resprout, they're really, really visible and they're much more attackable because all of that thatch and biomass is gone. So you can get right at the root with one swing of a tool and pop them right out of the ground. So we've had a lot of success using fire even with that. But as you can tell, these get more and more intensive with your follow-up treatments. You can't just use fire as these get more complicated. We also use fire just to remove grassland thatch. So a lot of the grasses that we do see in California that create the golden rolling hills are not native grasses. They are brought here with grazing animals upon colonization. And so if you remove that thatch, you can just like, first of all, improve your quality of graze, but also trigger an entire wildflower bloom that you may not really see in most years otherwise. So we've been using prescribed burning even just in areas that don't have really bad invasions of particularly bad invasive weeds, just to remove the thatch and allow for a better wildflower bloom that next year, with some really great success too. Another situation in which prescribed fire has become exceptionally useful and probably has been exceptionally useful for millennia, this is not new, would be in oak woodlands. So one of the areas, there are kind of two habitats that really, really suffer from a lack of prescribed burning after millennia of that management tool being used. And one of them is our oak woodlands. So as you go up the North Coast, we see more and more where Douglas fir becomes this dense layer in the understory that encroaches in oak woodlands without the use of a disturbance mechanism like prescribed burning. And as long as you're kind of at the very beginning of this piercing stage shown here, or earlier than that, you can use fire by itself potentially in many cases to wipe out that invasion and encroachment of Douglas fir in the understory of these oak woodlands. Once you get past or like a little ways into the piercing stage, it does require 2 steps where we're doing a lot of this work across the county, where we're cutting out these small Doug firs in the understory because they're already 12 feet or taller, piling them, burning them in piles. And then once we've reopened up that woodland structure, we're introducing broadcast burning in the understory to maintain that for the long haul. Because all of this, of course, is ecosystem process. It requires re-entry and continued treatment. We're also using prescribed fire in oak woodlands for a more exciting piece of that, which is there are the native acorn pests in California. There's acorn weevil, acorn moths, and if you use prescribed fire during the fall or winter period, you can almost completely knock out those pest populations and allow for those acorns to stay viable, which California has been having a lot of trouble with getting oaks to grow from young, early stages in our oak woodlands, as well as sudden oak death, knocking out a lot of our mature trees. So having viable acorns is a huge plus, not to mention the vast number of wildlife species that really depend on acorns to thrive as well, and people collecting acorns for food. So we are a huge fan of using prescribed fire for this technique. One other ecosystem that really depends on prescribed fire and disturbance is our coastal prairie grasslands. In particular, coastal prairie, I'm just speaking of because it's the most diverse grassland habitat in North America. We're down to about 5% of it in total, and it's just rapidly disappearing and degrading. And while some of that is from development and other issues, a lot of it is also from a lack of disturbance and a lack of prescribed fire, lack of grazing as well. So this is a photo series of one of the preserves that Audubon Canyon Ranch manages, which is Martin Griffin Preserve. And the tan areas here are coastal prairie. And in 1952, it was about 216 acres. And as of 2019, there were about 18 acres left. So really rapidly disappearing. And that's because it's being encroached by coyote brush, and then the coyote brush is being encroached by Douglas fir and pretty much completely wiping out that grassland structure. So we are now working really hard to get prescribed fire back on the ground to reopen up this grassland habitat and save it from completely blinking out. This is another set of photos from that same location, still Martin Griffin Preserve. This is a project that I get really excited about because on the right, you see the photo series there. There's a road that goes up that ridgeline, and that's the only fire road that existed along that entire swath of ground on the hills just outside of Bolinas. And so it's a really valuable fire road. And as of the early 2000s, I think, or maybe late 90s, they had to close that fire road because it was getting too encroached. You couldn't get past it and couldn't even be utilized. So we're going back out there, opening up that road, and then we're doing prescribed burning to knock back the coyote brush, and where we can to torch out some of the Douglas fir trees that have encroached in this coastal prairie. And it's been really exciting seeing how well the bunch grasses are actually bouncing back, even just with one entry using prescribed fire. We now have this beautiful sweeping view of the Bolinas Lagoon again, and completely smothering the foreground in that view is native bunch grasses. So it's been really effective very quickly with very little cost need also. Oh, shoot. Oh no. There we go. Okay, so I wanted to kind of shift from there's like all these reasons why we use prescribed fire. There are more as well. Of course, you could talk about just fuels reduction and the need for re-entering areas with prescribed fire more often. But I'm going to just shift into kind of what our program is doing and what's happening with community in this region that's leading a shift for change in the way we live with fire. So, like I said before, I'm director of Fire Forward, and we're a capacity building program for prescribed burning in the North Bay area. When we started out, we kind of developed this framework around how we were going to go about this. We were like, okay, we're going to organize community because you need community to come together to do the prescribed burning. And we're not going to reach pace and scale unless we're doing that as a community effort. Everyone's got to get involved. That'll help shift culture, all of these important components of making change, right? Grassroots efforts type thing. And then we also recognize that we needed to develop capacity. So we were going to need to start offering trainings and building up a gear cache. And then we knew that we needed to lead implementation because you have to start showing that something can be done in order for it to cascade into a normal thing that is done. And we wanted to make sure we were doing adaptive management as part of that. So we try to incorporate monitoring in our work as well, so that we can communicate back the findings and results of this work. Pretty quickly, organizing community turned into community organizing itself. But initially that started off with one, we worked with partners to develop the Bay Area Prescribed Fire Council. Prior to the Bay Area Prescribed Fire Council, the closest thing we had to a fire council in this area was the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council, which may sound like it includes the North Bay area, but it's based out of Humboldt. And if you've ever been to Humboldt, you know that Humboldt's issues with fire are pretty different from our issues with fire here in the Bay Area. The population density is very different. The demographics are very different. The ecosystems are different in many cases. So we needed to develop a fire council more locally that was going to be fully diving into the issues and challenges that we have here. Then we also worked with community partners to kind of spearhead the standing up of the Good Fire Alliance, which is this region's very first prescribed burn association. And prescribed burn associations come from, they're a model that's taken from the Midwest, where it used to be just like a handful of ranchers that would get together and do some burning on each other's properties. And while there are cases of that being the situation in which we're doing prescribed burning in the Good Fire Alliance here, we're finding that it's not overall exactly that model. The Good Fire Alliance here is not just landowners, even it's community citizens from all over the region who've decided that they want to come out and learn how to manage fire and how to read these landscapes and ecosystems and assess when they can get good fire on the ground and do so in a professional manner. We're then also now leading basic wildland firefighter trainings because we realized that with the population density here and the situations that we're dealing with, many of these people in the Good Fire Alliance needed to be operating at a professional level on the fire line. And so we've been teaching a lot of these basic wildland firefighter trainings around the region, most of them being based out of Sonoma Valley, but drawing people in from an 8-county area in some cases who are coming out and trying to develop these skills for themselves. All of this training and community organizing then pretty quickly self-developed into a demand from the community to be able to support wildfire response. So I know this is a tangent from prescribed fire, but it's turning out to be a really valuable part of this work. So during the lightning complex last summer, I, in the span of about 2 days, got about 12 emails from community members saying, hey, I'm fire line trained. You guys put me through this training. I meet professional standards. Can I just like go out there and start digging line with a shovel? Because I keep hearing about how they need more resources and I'm trained and I'm sitting here feeling helpless. So let's do this. And at first I didn't quite know how to even deal with that request, but I reached out to a local fire chief, Marshall Turbeville, at Northern Sonoma County Fire District. And he said, yes, he basically agreed to hire on a hand crew of folks that I would lead and organize from the Good Fire Alliance. And we turned into a 20-person hand crew that supported the wildfire response efforts. And while that was great that we were able to support wildfire response efforts, it also contributed to our ability to do prescribed fire in this region. So it helped build cohesion among this team, and these people who were on the crew had a chance to really get to know each other, and form this strong bond that created a core group of people who could do this work. It allowed us to provide ecological knowledge and expertise and nuance to the fire suppression industry. And all of these people know this landscape like the back of their hand because they grew up here. So they had a different kind of view of these landscapes than maybe the average person on a wildfire would. Additionally, it gave this group a chance, and myself and my team, a chance to work really closely hand in hand with fire agencies, who now we see out on our prescribed fires all the time, and we have an inherent trust of each other from working together. And so when we go to do prescribed fires, it's much easier now to reach out to, Joe, who I know over there at such and such fire department, about the fact that we're about to do a prescribed burn and invite him out to bring his department to come support the burn. So it was a really valuable piece for getting tied in with the suppression agencies as well on a prescribed fire angle. We then hosted the first prescribed fire training exchange of the Bay Area this past fall, which further contributed to really spearheading cohesion among the community, while about 75 people from the Good Fire Alliance came out to over 12 prescribed burns over the course of 2 months, as well as a series of trainings to further finesse their knowledge and expertise and ability to put fire on the ground. The photo on the left is from one of the early trainings we did, which was a spot fire training that folks were requesting. So we taught people how to suppress a spot fire so that if you have a prescribed burn and part of it gets outside of your perimeter that you wanted to keep fire within, these folks are now super ready to go and put that out and make sure it's not a threat. And it allowed a lot of opportunity for people to just continue to work together and get to know each other really well, which is a huge part of fire line work in general, is just having good teams that work together well, trust each other, and operate smoothly. We've now, since then, at this point, we've trained up about 350 people in the region as basic wildland firefighters who are now going out regularly on prescribed burns. And what we're learning is that we have a bit of a dearth of leadership. So my program has now started shifting to really trying to work on building up people who are able to lead on the fire line and run a squad or a crew that would be able to implement a good prescribed burn and make sure it's done well. So we're just launching a fellowship program through which we're hoping to train up people who can plan and organize burns and then offer leadership on the fire line as well. And that's going to be a big next piece of that capacity building that will change the way we can live with fire here. So more and more now, we're seeing that these community members, now that they've had all of this experience and they've developed community and they understand how to read fuels and how to read ecosystems, we have a whole new slew of community members who are going out and leading implementation on their own properties with community, with very little need for steering during these low risk windows. So it's been a little bit of a weird winter, but not that atypical for California in recent years. And there have been a lot of really good burn windows that are very low risk, during which people have been able to get really good fire on the ground and do a lot of great work. So this is a photo from a ranch right around the Mendocino-Sonoma County line. It's a 500-acre property, and one of the Good Fire Alliance community members invited about 8 people out to join him to carry good fire down from the ridgeline to the cabin at his family's 500-acre ranch out there. It was like perfect burning conditions. He spent the next couple of days kind of hiking the perimeter, making sure it all looked good, and it went exceptionally well. And they developed more knowledge and skills and slides in their head around what fire does in different conditions and how to make use of it in a safe and effective manner. Our program has also been working to build a really significant gear cache for a number of years. And initially, we were basically trying to get just enough gear that we wouldn't need to be relying on local fire departments for our prescribed burns, because local fire departments need to be able to stay ready to respond to an emergency incident if one happens during a burn. So they can't get completely tied up in the prescribed burns that are happening. So as a result, having a gear cache that's a community resource that can go from burn to burn and support landowners in making sure that they have everything they need makes it so that those fire agencies are able to participate if they want to for the training opportunity, but we're not being a burden on them by doing this important work. So we immediately got to building a gear cache and then continued to build that gear cache to have more and more of what may be needed on the fire line. But what we're pretty quickly learning now is that a gear cache in one place is just not enough. It works well when you're only doing one burn on any given day across the region. But what we're finding is that the best burn windows are usually one day right before the rain comes in. And there's so many projects now and so many places to get good fire on the ground that we really need gear caches everywhere. So I've started kind of using a new slogan, which is that every single landowner, just like every landowner has a chainsaw and knows how to use it safely and effectively, I really do think that every landowner should have a chainsaw and a drip torch and know how to use it safely and effectively. And I'm not saying people should be going out there, no clue what they're doing, like lighting the ground on fire in July, but there are some really great opportunities for reducing fuels during these winter windows where people could be significantly changing what a wildfire could do during the summer by just actively getting out there on the ground and seeing what they can accomplish during the winter. So this is a short video clip from a property in Occidental where I went and joined a couple of Good Fire Alliance community members just about a month ago. And we were just seeing what we could do on the morning before the rains came in, just a few hours later, to reduce some of the fuels around their houses just about a month ago. So you see it's pretty like low to moderate fire behavior. It was only really burning in the jackpots of redwood material, wasn't really burning in the brush and the houses right there next to it. And since doing that, that landowner has now burned about 3 acres of material that was all around his house. So the 3 acres of completely accumulated fuel in the redwood understory that were surrounding what is actually a totally wooden house next to this one is now completely free of excess fuel in the understory, and is starting to pop up with some more interesting biodiversity in the understory as well. There we go. So that's all I've got. We're basically just finding that the community is now becoming self-organizing. We're finding our program is constantly shifting angles to figure out what the needs are and continue to break through these barriers and figure out solutions. But the capacity is really rapidly growing, and especially as we are seeing landowners starting to develop their own caches and organize with community and get out there and do treatments on the ground in these low risk windows. a lot is getting accomplished in a very short time, and we are changing the way we live with fire right now. So thanks for having me, and I think there's time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sasha, for your presentation. It's really fascinating and important work. If folks have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat box. There are a few sitting here that I'll start with. Cody Cifuentes Winter asks or says, they sat in on a talk from the Chaparral Institute. The use of prescribed fire should be limited to forests that have missed at least 2 fire rotations, with prioritization given to natural fire use, meaning allowing lightning fires to occur safely away from communities. They'd love to hear your comments on this.
That's awesome. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in case I can find Cody. That's a great question. So the Chaparral, such a sticky question. The Chaparral Institute does really awesome work. It's based in Southern California, and Southern California is having a completely different issue with fire, where they're having really frequent repeat fire or repeat ignitions in Chaparral that's converting Chaparral to grassland. And I'm not talking about like a little bit of coyote brush. I'm talking about like beautiful, diverse chaparral that's just getting completely wiped out and replaced with non-native grass species of like monocultures of bromus. So they're doing really awesome work to try to get that under control and change that problem. The research that they really focus on and highlight is research that's specific to Southern California, and the issues in Northern California are quite different in many ways. That being said, my program and myself, like as a fire ecologist, we don't advocate for prescribed burning in true chaparral. So like your chamise, manzanita, ceanothus, like we're not really talking about using prescribed fire in those stands. And even where we're talking about using fire in grasslands, we're talking about like for protecting grasslands, we're talking about burning in coyote brush for the most part. It's not that like chamise and manzanita and ceanothus shouldn't burn, but wildfire is going to burn them at some point anyways. And then they're going to be reset by wildfire. There's no like real level of fire intensity in chaparral, those like true chaparral species, that's going to be harmful to them. So there's no reason for us to be putting our very precious time toward burning in chaparral. That's just going to benefit from wildfire, when we could be using that very precious time and effort and energy to be restoring and protecting coastal prairie and protecting woodlands and some forests from the negative impacts of wildfire. Because those are ones where, as fuel accumulates, they're going to be really negatively impacted by wildfire, where prescribed burns can protect them from that negative impact. So yeah, very nuanced answer. Hopefully that makes some sense, but yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Sasha. Okay, so the next question is from Alex Michael. To address harding grass, you mentioned prescribed burns followed by hand tools to remove the roots. Would there be a way to achieve similar results with grazing after prescribed burns?
That's a great question. Again, it's still like harding grass is still a perennial species with really deep root systems. So I would imagine you would probably have to like completely degrade that swath of grassland by like hammering it so hard that nothing could grow in order to actually have a lasting impact on harding grass in that way. The reason we use a hand tool is it pops the whole little root clump out of the ground. And if you even just like scatter a tiny bit of native grass seed in there, you completely replace the harding grass with native grass really readily. So I think that grazing would probably just like keep it trimmed way down after fire, which is still better than a thatched mat across an entire harding grass meadow. But you're probably still going to have harding grass when you're done grazing.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Michael Fitzgibbon with Point Blue asks, how do you see prescribed burning meshing with the California push to sequester carbon on the landscape?
Yeah, so prescribed burning helps create or steward for more stable carbon. So in California, fire is not a matter of if, but when. Like, we can't stop wildfire from happening, it's going to happen. So the question is, how do we want fire to behave on the landscape, and do we want it to be on our terms? When we're using fire in, like, using prescribed burning in woodlands and forests, what we're doing is managing for stable carbon. So we're reducing the amount of small trees and understory debris and fuel load accumulation that in a wildfire would mean that all of those mature trees would be much more likely to torch out and die. And that's hundreds of years of carbon in those older trees that's all of a sudden wiped out. Whereas if we're doing prescribed burning and just taking off that tiny bit of accumulated fuels, those trees have a much, much stronger or higher chance of making it through a wildfire and staying on the landscape as resilient and stable carbon through fire cycles, especially as climate change becomes a bigger and bigger issue. There's even a really cool study from the Sierras that showed that our unburned forests in the Sierras are carbon loss, not carbon sinks, because they're so unhealthy and out of balance that they're no longer carbon sinks. So yeah, we're helping carbon balance by prescribed burning in forests and woodlands.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. We have another one from Alex Michael. The question is, for prescribed burns larger than a brush pile, what sorts of permits would landowners need if they wanted to just go out with a drip torch?
Nice. I like that one because it might actually get people closer to burning. So it depends, of course. So many things in the world it depends. But if you're outside of fire, it's just an air quality permitting process. If you're doing that on private land with private money as a private citizen, all of that. So outside of fire season, as a private landowner, not using public funds, you just need an air quality permit. And that's going to be different depending on where you are. If you're in the Northern Sonoma County Fire District, it's as simple as like a $100 permit for a year lets you burn up to 3 acres a day on your private property, which is pretty cool. And 3 acres a day is a nice, reasonable size for one landowner to actually safely manage what they're doing if they're just getting started on this. If you're in even the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, anything under 5 acres is considered basically open burning as well. So kind of a similar situation there. Although I'm constantly in conversations with their Air Quality Management District trying to figure out the nuances of what they're doing with their permitting system. So that's constantly in flux right now. And then, yeah, if you're up in Mendocino, you can burn on an air quality permit up to, I think, 200 acres a day. So it gets kind of crazy if you go out that direction. So it's variable. As soon as you get into fire season, you start needing permits from CAL FIRE because fire season is burn ban season, and you need a permit from CAL FIRE saying that they are waiving burn ban for you because you've done all your due diligence and you meet their permit requirements. So that gets a little more complicated. And that's usually when we bring in a burn boss and have a really organized crew that's meeting kind of the federal standards or state standards for doing professional style burns.
Great, that's really helpful, really useful information. Sort of following up on that, I think, so Taj Hittenberger, who's with Point Blue, working up in the Bay Area, asks, when working with landowners who are interested in prescribed burning, what's the best way to help them line up the necessary permits and resources to conduct a burn with the Good Fire Alliance? Nice.
Taj, I'm hoping we'll be able to show you that whole process over the course of the next year. But usually it is like going out, doing a site visit, looking at what on their property, talking with them about the ways in which they could use fire to benefit the ground that they're holding and responsible for. And then depending on what the approach is, if we're talking about winter burning or an organized, formal, prescribed burn, it may be putting together a burn plan and getting those permits, the air quality and CAL FIRE permits. And then, coordinating those resources and making it happen.
Great. Awesome. I have one question from so for your Martin Griffin Preserve, you were talking about sort of managing coyote brush with prescribed fire, and I know that there's some research out there demonstrating that you conducting prescribed burns 2 years in a row can really sort of maximize the benefits. Is that what you all are finding, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we haven't had the good fortune yet of burning 2 years in a row in standing coyote brush. The coyote brush is really tough in that, like a lot of other types of like actual chaparral, it burns or it doesn't. It's very binary. You have to get like a good wind and pretty dry conditions to get fire to actually carry through it. What we've had a lot of success with has been cutting Douglas fir material and putting it on top of coyote brush and then burning that as kind of like a patch jackpot. And the added heat of the additional material in that one burn has actually caused the coyote brush to not sprout back a second year. I don't have an actual percentage, but an off the cuff wag would be like 70% of our patch burns where we've done that piling material and burning the patch have not resprouted. And we've seen native violets, violets come back up in pretty high density. And we've been able to sprinkle native grass seed and have a dense patch of native grass come back up as well.
Oh, really interesting.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for that answer. I think we have one more question, and then that'll sort of probably bring us to the top of the hour. So Taj has one follow-up question. He wanted to piggyback on what Michael had asked with the carbon dynamics with prescribed burns. And he's wondering if there's any local research or monitoring on the effects of prescribed fire on carbon or soil carbon sort of in grasslands around the Bay Area.
That would be cool. I haven't seen that. Yeah. Fire Forward is currently doing some monitoring plots, just showing fuel load change and canopy structure and kind of general forest and woodland health metrics in our prescribed burns in woodlands and forests. But we have not found a research collaborator to work with on actually getting some carbon soil sampling. Although Chelsea, maybe you're a good person to talk to about that. Yeah. We're hoping that we can start working more and more with people who are doing like hard research questions, who can make use of the monitoring plots that we already have and just kind of stack other questions and other research on top of those. Because there is definitely a dearth of like hard science from our region on fire ecology and fire science. So it'd be awesome to get more of that.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, that's a good lead. Thanks for teeing that up, Taj, for us. Yeah, we'll have to follow up. Awesome. Okay. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I'll just, say thank you so much again for taking time out of your day to share your knowledge and expertise with us. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say it was really great to learn from you today. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining this week's session. I'll look forward to seeing everybody again next week. I think we have Point Blues Dr. Jay Roberts on the lineup, and I see a lot of thank yous coming in. You can't see them, Sasha, because they're all coming to me, but a lot of thank yous from the group right now. That's all we have time for. And thanks to everyone, and until next time.
Thank you all. Awesome.